Hi, I'm Scott Hansel, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today, I'm chatting with Aran Khanna. He is the co-founder and CEO of Archera. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
So, I, as a individual developer who does like side projects and startup consulting, I kind of pay as you go. And I've been doing pay as you go in the cloud for, 17, 18 years. But I'm realizing that if I were to get serious about the cloud, I could probably save a ton of money if I would just commit. But then I'm realizing that cloud commitments are like this financial instrument that's hiding inside of a developer infrastructure. And I just don't want to buy a year's worth of compute. And Archera seems to have a solution for that for at least most businesses. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, commitments are almost on their face to some extent antithetical to what the cloud promise was to developers like you and me, which is, pay for what you need, turn it on, turn it off, and, pay as you go. But, my background is I actually spent almost a decade working for the hyperscalers, working for Azure, working for AWS in launching a lot of these services. And what you realize is there's a ton of capital expense that goes into these projects. And so having committed revenue from customers is actually incredibly valuable. And in fact, as the cost of data center builds go up, it's actually more and more necessary. And the main way that historically cloud providers have incentivized customers who are really sold on this pay-as-you-go model, as you and I were when we first started in the cloud, building and experimenting and doing hobbies, was to give deep discounts for actually committing to infrastructure versus running it on demand. These things can go north of 80% if you take something from a, second by second usage pattern to a 3-year committed usage pattern. And most developers, obviously, especially if you're running a small hobby, you don't know what's going to happen with it. They don't feel really comfortable committing. They're willing to pay the premium. But when you get to running a business on the cloud, especially a serious business running at scale, we work with some of the biggest cloud customers in the world here at Archera. You have portfolios of hundreds of millions, if not even now billions of dollars committed to the cloud providers. And it's become, one of the largest problems that we see in the cloud ecosystem today, not just the technology problem, but the financial problem that precipitates from it.
Yeah, it almost seems like we as developers were so enamored with the idea of this infinitely scalable, elastic cloud that we kind of forgot it's still hosting and there's still machines there. And if the machines aren't spinning, then who's paying for all of that? And they're being wasted. So then that means that if I'm doing pay as you go, I'm effectively paying a huge premium for the elasticity, for that bursty kind of thing. And as a startup, you would think I would want to actually pay less. Like you said, 80%. I mean, I've seen 50, 60, 70%, like crazy upfronts. Buying a VM is pretty reasonable, but buying it for a year is like you pay for 4 months and the rest is free. I'm leaving money on the table, but then I worry that what if my company goes under, or what if I need more? What if I need less? I just don't want to spend. I want to spend the least amount possible.
That's exactly it. And what's really interesting, you talked about that illusion of infinite capacity before that existed in the cloud. Now with tokens and GPUs and capacity shortages in AI, like that illusion itself is almost broken, right? We see that often in 2026, you're required to get a commitment just to have access to something like a latest generation or even an older generation GPU nowadays, given the capacity crunch. And that's really what Archera is kind of holistically helping customers solve for. If they need to commit to get access to capacity, or if they're interested in getting the discount, but they have uncertainty. They don't know if they're going to be using this GPU for the whole year. They don't know if they need all this compute, 3 years on, their business, if they're a startup, might not even be around, or it might be doing something completely different. And what we do is we help them hedge that downside risk by a unique product. We're the only ones in the space offering it, called Insured Commitments, which is essentially as simple as saying, hey, if you commit for 3 years, but you don't use, say, the last 24 months, we'll pay you back the difference for that whole 24-month period if you're basically having a commitment sitting there in your inventory that's not being used. And this gives customers the confidence to commit with that downside risk protected and capture more of that discount, get resources that actually require commitments they otherwise wouldn't be willing to commit to, like GPUs. and really provide a new option that they can put into that overall commitment portfolio. What we see is that customers generally, the most sophisticated, biggest ones that we work with, like Hex has become a really big AI native customer. They've been running with us for 7 years. Traditionally it would be a mix of on-demand, 1 year and 3 year commitments. Now when they're mature, they're actually looking at a mix of on-demand, insured 1 year commitments, regular 1 year commitments, insured 3 year commitments, regular 3 year commitments. And it becomes a lot more of a dynamic portfolio that helps them really match the risk in their business with the kind of best pricing that they can get out of these cloud provider constructs.
So the cloud is an abstraction layer. And as a developer, I get to pretend that there isn't capital expenditure. I don't get to pretend that the giant building and the giant data center doesn't exist. I just, I burst when I want to burst. But let's pretend for a second that I've never heard the words FinOps or reserved instance. Maybe talk to me like I'm 5. There's a giant Costco with a bunch of computers in it, and they're not all working very hard. Why is it okay for them to give me 80% off? And why do they want reserved instances?
Yeah. So, a core part of this just goes back to uh, how these services, like you said, get built. You are actually going and buying machines and putting them into a data center, which takes a lot of money up front. In fact, the best analogy I found in an explain it like I'm 5 sort of way is looking at this almost like building an apartment building. We all live somewhere. There's a big apartment building down the block. It takes a lot of money to go and build these apartments, but then you got to sell them. And you could put them up on Airbnb. You'll probably get the best price, but you might not fill it, the whole year, right? You're going to have a lot of vacant apartments if you're only Airbnb-ing, and you might not recoup that cost. And in fact, you generally have a loan against that apartment, and they don't want to, underwrite Airbnb revenue. They want to underwrite, 1 year, 3 year apartment leases where there's a guarantee of spend every single month coming in, not some variable expense. The same way these cloud providers go and take loans, CoreWeave is a very extreme example, but all of them do this, to go and put up GPU capacity to build these data centers. They don't want to just rent it out on demand with no guarantee. In fact, they probably can't secure their loans if they do that. They want to have those 1 year and 3 year leases. And the same way as when you rent an apartment and you sign a 1 year lease versus a 3 year lease, you're going to get a better rate. If you sign a 1 year lease on a database, you're going to get a better rate than running it on demand. But if you sign a 3 year rate, at least you're going to get the best rate. And then really the way to think about Archera and all of this is thinking about essentially having the right to break that lease. So let's say, get a new job in Memphis. You want to get an apartment there, but you need to sign a lease. You don't know if you're going to keep the job after a year, but you sign a 3 year lease, you get a great rate. We'll essentially sell you the right to break that lease after that first year if your job circumstances change. Means you can get the right capacity, that right apartment. You can get it at a much better price than, say, Airbnb the whole time that you're in Memphis. But you have that downside protection baked in.
So is this a trick, or is this, do the cloud people know you exist? Because if I break my lease, the landlord will be upset with me. But if the landlord knew that I had Archera insurance, they might be okay with it.
Yeah, and that's exactly how we've gone to market, actually, is we've partnered incredibly deeply with all of the hyperscalers, AWS, Azure, Google. In fact, most of our revenue actually comes through selling on the cloud providers' marketplaces. So the Google, Azure, AWS marketplace is where we do actually most of our revenue and most of our volume. So we're really tightly integrated with them. And they love it. In fact, their sales teams love it because they are incentivized to sign bigger deals, to sign these commitments. And often it's very difficult to get customers to commit larger amounts and to commit for longer because of that downside risk aversion that they have. So having something like this they could bring into a deal really helps in terms of closing deals, getting more velocity in terms of their contracts and what they're able to deliver to customers. And then obviously the customers love it because instead of sitting on something that's unused and getting mad at Amazon or mad at Azure, they actually have an out. They can take those dollars and reinvest them in new initiatives. So it's really value added for the whole ecosystem, the same way that, Ford probably wants Geico to exist, right? They want to have someone who insures these car purchases so people will actually purchase the big expensive F-150 in the first place.
Now, I had a fender bender recently, or my son did, and there was an interesting discussion as I was teaching my son how insurance works and explaining the different flavors of insurance and one could do. And he was wondering if the other person could have bought insurance and then pretended to backdate it and, basically game the system. So we had conversations about insurance. How do you prevent abuse from someone who might know that their startup's going out of business and try to go and buy insurance and then make you insolvent?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that comes down to the core of insurance, which is underwriting, right? And
Mm.
part of underwriting is to avoid this thing that's called moral hazard, which is essentially where someone goes and buys insurance and then takes a lot of risks because they have insurance. So there's a few kind of ways that we do this. I think the simplest way is essentially we ensure that the customer has some skin in the game. We
Mm.
get usage data when we work with a customer going back at least a year, if not more, and we can see what they've actually been spending money on in their cloud provider. We can see some of that history, and those are real dollars spent. So they, if they're going to try and trick us, they would have to spend a lot of money to do it. So I think there's kind of a default guardrail that we have around, when we even make an offer. Beyond that, we actually have, now a petabyte plus of historical usage data across thousands of customers. So we're able to actually go in and very granularly understand, hey, other customers that look like this customer, how long do they keep their, RDS database up? And we have very strong priors, is what we call it in the data
Mm.
science world, on like what the longevity of these instances are. And then finally, there's kind of the last layer, which is almost, and my co-founder came from the finance world. He was at DE Shaw doing, quantitative pricing and
Mhm.
Uber after that. It's really this portfolio construction problem because you actually want to build a very diversified book where you're not overexposed to any one instance type, any one GPU type, any one customer type, or any one customer in general. And so that kind of last layer, those are kind of the categories of the guardrails that we have in place to ensure that we're not getting selected against. We're finding, deals that make sense for both parties, and we're able to surface that up in the right way to end customers.
Is this that term I've heard quant, where there's a quant who is the person who is really doing the deep statistical analysis, and the more diverse your portfolio as an insurance company, the better?
That's exactly it, right? We're taking a very data driven quantitative or quant approach. And in fact, we do have folks who act as quants within our business in terms of maintaining our underwriting algorithm, understanding where we should offer insurance versus pull it back, and even thinking about like pricing very granularly. Where should we price a little bit more or price a little bit less, depending on the actual implied risk that we're taking. So it's very much part of the moat of this business, the fact
Mm.
that we've been doing this for 7 years and have such a rich data set, such a broad array of customers, and have really built expertise in this very niche thing that we're kind of the pioneer in.
So this might be a little spicy, but I'm sure you wouldn't appreciate a spicy question. Like, when did cloud billing first feel broken to you? And was the pitch was only pay for what you use? And I'm curious if you think at enterprise scale that's still true, or this is the correct solution to that broken problem.
Yeah, the cloud billing started to feel broken, frankly, when those two initial promises that we opened the show with, the illusion of unlimited capacity and then, the pay as you go nature, started to break down. Now, the original idea of like a reserved instance, it was interesting, but it didn't feel unusual when it came out in the early 2010s from Amazon. Hey, this box is one that we're going to keep up for a while. We should be consuming this in a slightly different way. But fast forward to 2017 when we were launching SageMaker. I was part of that original launch team over at AWS, and we were saying, look, for specific SKUs, we're not going to buy that much NVIDIA gear. This was back then. Now I guess they're buying as much as they can. And so we're going to have a limit on capacity. So people are going to have to make a commitment just to show they're bought in so we can give them some of that capacity. And so this idea of a commitment turned from something that could provide financial leverage and match sort of the customer's consumption pattern, a la a reserved instance, to something that almost felt like a hammer that everything started to look like a nail with. Oh, we have a limited capacity. Okay, throw a commitment in front of the problem and that'll fix it. Oh, we want to actually stop customers from going multi-cloud. Let's make a big commitment program, like a private pricing agreement program, and throw a Microsoft Azure commitment program and throw everything into that. Oh, we have issues around customers wanting to modernize their infrastructure. Let's just make a new commitment type called a savings plan and throw everything in that. So, this initial idea that started to make sense around a cloud commitment more and more stuff got piled onto it to solve more and more problems. And I think it started to become quite a spaghetti mess for customers to both understand and then ultimately to take advantage of in a way that made the most sense for their business.
I was at Costco and I bought, I want to say, 900 Advil for like $25. And then I was at the Hilton a couple of weeks ago and I bought two Advil for $5. It was unbelievable. So I'm starting to think that like on demand pricing is the convenience store price of compute and not the real price.
I think that's generally it, right? It's almost the promotional price. That's where you want to prototype at. That's where you
Right.
want to like understand, hey, this works. But then if you're actually going to run the thing, it's imperative to start looking at commitments. And maybe a 1 year commitment doesn't make sense. Maybe you want to start with committing for a shorter amount of time, and that's where something like Archera's insurance comes in, where you're like, hey, this project works. I'm going to keep it up for a quarter. I don't want to be paying the crazy premium. I might even keep running it after the quarter, but I don't want to pay for the whole year. I don't feel comfortable there. And that's a great use case for something like an insurance provider like us to come in and say, hey, we'll share some of that risk with you. But by default, you're going to get the best rate. And one of the really cool things about Archera is that if you get confidence that, hey, I'm going to use this to the rest of the term, you can just cancel the insurance and stop paying. So you're never really locked in. You're always able to go back to what you're able to do kind of by default with the cloud provider. But you have now a partner that can offlay that risk and allow you to kind of crawl, walk, run into those bigger commitments as the project matures versus being stuck at that promotional pricing where you're not really going to be able to get a lot of leverage on your dollar.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like developers love elasticity. I definitely do. But like a CFO, they love predictability. They don't care what the developers think. And it feels like the modern cloud is arguably trying to sell to both sides. And it's something that can't fully coexist. And you are trying to make it coexist. You're trying to make both sides happy.
Yeah, and that's FinOps broadly, but I think in our space specifically of FinOps, where we deal with rate optimization and commitments and upfront spend, we're very much at the forefront of that interface between the DevOps team, the infrastructure team, the office of the CIO or CTO, and the VP of Finance, the
Mm,
FinOps team, the VP or the CFO, right? And it is nuanced because they want to see things and understand things in very different ways, but ultimately they have the same goal, which is to get the best leverage on the dollar and the most predictability in a fundamentally unpredictable
yeah.
space. And so that's what we're trying to do, is trying to give them guardrails and bounds around what they are, going to use and what they're going to spend. But also provide, again, we have a completely free tool that comes along with, the underwriting and all that we provide and the options that we give customers they can opt into to give them some of that additional visibility. And we have a
Hmm.
ton of partners that help us with that as well, because I think without that visibility, which we partner heavily on and give a lot of tools away for free on, you're not going to find alignment. And that alignment then speaks to the core of the problem on like, hey, there's a principal agent problem here. The DevOps person doesn't want to take risk. The finance person wants predictability and wants to actually put some risk and some commitment in place that they can actually track against. How do we reconcile that? Without that visibility, you never get that conversation. And then a solution like this never becomes, clearly the go forward.
Yeah. You would think from talking to cloud folks who are just out there buying GPUs and building new data centers that everything is maxed out at 100%. And the only problem in the cloud is like build more spaces in a field in Utah somewhere. But it feels to me like the thing that no one's talking about underneath this is that there is unused capacity, and they need to find a way to sell that. And it seems like selling commitments is the way to solve that. I wonder what's true.
I think it's a textured problem because for certain SKUs, like take, the Grace Blackwell 300s, right? Those are very new NVIDIA machines, tough to deploy because they require liquid cooling and a lot of power. There's a clear supply demand imbalance there.
Hmm.
More recently, you look at things like ARM CPUs in the data center. There's still plenty of those out there. In fact, for the last 2 years, over 50% of the new CPUs in the data center on the AWS fleet were Graviton and ARM based. But you look at something like an x86. Intel CPU in the Azure data center, at least in a popular region, those might be
Mhm.
harder to get. And so again, it's a very textured problem in terms of like different SKUs have different demand supply profiles. But generally, I think in the areas of the market where there is a high degree of demand relative to supply, the commitment is the way that that problem is being solved. It's not a clean solve, obviously, because people want to make sure that if there's high demand, they can get the capacity, and they might not use it. They might just sit on it, but at least they're renting it out versus it's sitting idle and not being rented in the data center.
Mm.
And again, it's obviously a very dynamic market. But I would say that that's been the primary tool. And when we talk to customers, we work with a ton of startups that are running on the hyperscalers and even the neo clouds. This is kind of the biggest hand wringing for them. How much do they overcommit so that they're ensuring their capacity, and having, again, a partner like us in the mix where we can say, look, you want to overcommit 5x, we're happy to take 1x or 2x of that, and risk share that with you for a price. It gives them some of that flexibility.
It's so funny how the things that I naively would think are intuitive are not when you look at things at scale. I'm thinking about, you said the word overcommit, and I'm thinking about times that I've been on a plane and they've told me they overbooked, or the times that you've rented a car and you do that Jerry Seinfeld thing where it's like, I have a reservation. And they're like, well, no, like, no, you should have the car here. I reserved it. I should have my finger on the car. Like, if they nail it, they're going to reserve everything. They're going to be at 100% or 90% CPU all the time, and everybody wins. But if they do it wrong, then it's a problem. So it feels like right sizing, is it a technical problem or is it a organizational problem? Like, is cloud waste technical waste or is it organizational waste?
It's really a combined problem. And I think the way that we think about it is there's really two sides to the cloud cost kind of world.
Mm-hmm.
There's the usage optimization, which is saying, hey,
Mm,
it's how I'm running the most efficient way. Let's say I'm like serving, Netflix videos. Is my cost per video served as efficient as possible? Even if I just take the on-demand, pay as you go rate, am I architected in an
right.
efficient way? That's very much an engineering question, an engineering problem. On the other side, there's rate optimization, which is distinct from usage optimization. And that's kind of where we play,
Mm-hmm.
which is really, what have I spent in the past? What can I comfortably commit to going forward? And what does that stack of commitments end up looking like over time? And there's more fundamental questions there than just the infrastructure questions. It's like, how fast do I think my business is going to grow? Do I think I'm going to see customer churn? What does that mean in terms of what I'm comfortable committing to? In fact, even looking at that first world of usage optimization, you might say, hey, I have the ability to save 30% on my cluster. It's going to take a 2-year migration, but I have that ability. Do I want to factor that in to what I commit? So, visibility, forecasting, and really planning that commitment portfolio is in that second bucket. And again, that's more of a finance problem, but they're very related, right? These things, again, have to speak to each other and use some sort of common language, as I was saying earlier.
Right. Now, you said that you have petabytes of data, like you're getting aggregated data across, kind of anonymized aggregated data across all of it. And that's how you are able to do your pricing. But you would think that companies would have their own usage data. So why would a company overbuy or underbuy when they themselves have years of usage data? Is that a blind spot on their part?
Well, the thing is that, there's kind of two aspects to this. One is just understanding that usage data in and of itself is difficult. That's why there's this
Mm,
whole vendor ecosystem of folks to help with just getting visibility on cloud costs. Many of our partners actually kind of play in that space as an example. And so just the expertise to understand, distill, and then forecast based on that data is non-trivial. But even beyond that, there are known unknowns. So even if you have perfect forecasting in your data, known unknowns like how fast will I grow my business? If I am just towing that line and committing, to every marginal GPU as a customer comes on, what happens if we have a capacity crunch and I'm not able to get more GPUs to serve the marginal customers? Should I overcommit now? That's something that actually a lot of our startups are thinking about. Like, do I just buy a lot more now, a bigger chunk, and grow into it and not take the risk that I won't have capacity down the line?
mm,
These are kind of the known unknowns. I mean, will my architecture change? Even if you are the person doing the usage optimization, you don't know if your database architecture is going to look the same in 18 months. No one does.
mhm.
So it's really those known unknowns that having a partner like us can come in and help, because we've seen now thousands of customers that look like you. So you might only see your own data. We've seen tons of customers that look like use data. So we actually have a prior. We're able to price that in a sense more effectively than you might be.
Okay, that's funny that you say that because that's kind of where my next question was kind of going, which is like all of this sounds simple, but pricing risk by its definition is hard. So I was going to ask, what are the signals that would allow Archera to say this is a workload that is safe enough to insure? That's data.
Yes. Well, there's a lot, right? So it's
Mm.
what is the specific, and just to give you a sense, we are pretty lightweight. We'll get to your point, kind of anonymized metadata on what is the spend, what is up, what is down. If there are tags on these machines like production versus R&D, basically just the metadata around the billing and usage in the environment. But even through that, just what are the machines being used? What is the type of business that this is, right? Just a simple Crunchbase lookup or looking in our CRM on how understanding the employees and funding, understanding the tags on the machines, understanding, things like very specific, services and their lifetime. So if someone is migrating and on something like, Azure VMware service, they're very likely to start migrating some of that capacity to AKS within a year. Okay, so I probably won't offer that much on the Azure VMware service commitments relative to something like AKS. So there's a lot of really granular decisioning, and the beautiful thing about modern machine learning is that you can basically put this all into a feature vector and have a set of algorithms basically rank these things for you, from random forest through to deep neural networks, and actually come up with some of these statistical correlations and outcomes of the historical data that we're able to apply in a future-looking way.
Now, but all the data you have, is it all people with insurance? Or because wouldn't insurance by definition change customers' behavior
Yeah,
and someone would take a
actually,
different risk if the downside is bounded?
and it's a great question. It speaks to that moral hazard point. So two things. One is we actually don't see too much moral hazard because of some of the things like you have to run the workload for a certain amount of time beforehand before we actually will offer insurance, things like that. But even that aside, only about 40% of the customers on our platform at any time are procuring insurance from us.
Hmm.
They love to have one, we offer a lot of free services and tools to understand your bill, to do some of the basic stuff around forecasting and commitment planning. We'll actually automate the full native commitment lifecycle management for customers entirely for free. And a lot of customers will use us for that. Really, our goal is to put these quotes for, if and when insurance makes sense for both parties, for us and them, in front of the customers in a timely manner, like in the right way. And so as a function of that, we see a good amount of uninsured committed spend, even from customers buying insurance from us. But we see a lot of customers that don't have that spend, that are, maybe waiting just for the right quote from us to go and buy it at some point. Right? That's the hope.
Now, this might be putting you on the spot, but cloud bills are notoriously weird. What is the gnarliest billing edge case that you can think of? Keeping anonymous, like what's the weirdest thing you've bumped into in your experience?
Yeah, without talking about any specific customers, once you start getting to the scale of like 80, $90 million a year with a single provider, there are crazy things that come up. Like, first of all, you have to upgrade your database just to ingest the bill and parse it. But two, you'll actually see that on every bill or every other bill, depending on the scale, the provider themselves will often have billing errors in putting it together, especially because you have custom pricing and other things, at that scale. I think the other thing, especially when you look at things like the Azure ecosystem and how they've changed their contracting structure from like enterprise agreements now to max, is there's so much being lost in translation there, especially for the big scaled accounts, that the bills themselves are often not treatable as a source of truth. And I think once that starts to break, a lot of things downstream of that, start to break. So those have been kind of the class of problems that I think have been the most gnarly and interesting when you can't trust the bill itself coming from the provider.
Wow. Okay. So for folks that are listening, what is the right size when they think, I think we're big enough, we need cloud insurance. We're a startup, we're selling this much, or we're spending that much. Maybe I, Scott Hanselman, don't need it because I'm little, or maybe I do. What's the right size for someone to reach out?
Yeah, well, frankly, we work with customers that, range from a two-person startup on credits where they're making their first commitment ever to like a database that,
Oh, wow.
they
Okay.
want to save like $50 on. And again, it's a very lightweight. There's no infrastructure changes, 5 minutes to share your bill and get a quote. So again, we work with like small YC companies like that.
Hmm.
But generally what we say is when you're around, $100 to $200,000 a year of spend in the cloud, that's when the numbers start to become very meaningful. Like we're talking about, funding an initiative, like a whole new AI initiative, or potentially we're even talking about funding a headcount once we get to the 500K plus a year level. And so, I would say that really people use us as an individual developer tool. Small startups use us, especially now with just being required to get a commitment to sign a GPU. If there are two guys in a garage and want a GPU, they'll often use us for that. But the meaningful numbers start to come at that 100K to 500K scale in terms of to a business, to an enterprise.
Okay, that's more accessible than I realized. I mean, a startup and a couple of folks in a garage really could potentially save some money on that.
Yeah, and it's often meaningful to them. Like we have a guy who runs a side project that has scaled up to now 20K per month, but it was running at $200 a month, and they bought some cloud insurance, ended up saving $75 a month. It was meaningful for him, running off of his credit card.
Fantastic. All right. Well, folks can learn more at archera.ai. That's ARCHERA.ai. And I have been chatting with Aran Khanna, co-founder and CEO of Archera. Thanks for hanging out with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. It was great to chat.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.